Hey everyone, Marnix here. One of my personal favorite games has to be Star Citizen, and I have been following the development of that game because if you don't know, newsflash, it's still not really out yet. I've been following that game since I think 2015. Christmas 2015 is when I decided to get myself invested into it. I'm a huge sci-fi fan and that game really just spoke to me. And yeah, I've been following the development not that closely. Honestly, it's been like at least half a year since I played it for the last time. But I've been following the development closely, and there was this one thing that I always heard again when, especially back in those days, there wasn't really that much to do yet. And everyone was saying like, oh, don't worry, next update they're gonna push, the game is finally gonna be like playable, they'll have a core gameplay loop ready, and you'll be able to finally do something. And that made me wondering, what are they actually talking about? What are core gameplay loops? And that actually leads me into today's topic. I want to talk about what Star Citizen has learned me about game design and game development. And not just that it takes much longer than you think, but what are those core gameplay loops? That always stuck with me, and now that I am making my own games, I never really thought about it that much, but I realized that Star Citizen taught me a lot, like just following the development because it's so open about gameplay loops, and you probably have better things to do than to spend 8 years at this point. Well, I think the game has been in development for more than 10, just following what everyone is doing. And honestly, even I get sick of like the slow progress sometimes. So I wanted to sit down and talk about what are core gameplay loops, and when you are designing your own game, how do you incorporate them into your gameplay? You probably have an idea of what they are, but maybe not fully understand how should you use them. So be sure to stick around. So I'll quickly explain what is a core gameplay loop, and then I'll link it back to some games with actual examples. The easiest way to see a core gameplay loop is simply what can you do in your game and what do you do more than once in your game. Most likely it will become a core gameplay loop then. So how do we look at this when we have Star Citizen? Well, the first core gameplay loop is simply flying around in your spaceship. So how do you go from point A to point B over a vast expanse of like space? That's a core gameplay loop. Or when I first heard the term, they were just implementing this, there's this like very like rundown, like illegal activity space stations, like a bit hidden, called Grimhacks. And they were finally going to get a prison gameplay loop. So what that meant is that before, you know, if you like did some crimes, you would just get killed by the automated forces. Now you wouldn't just get killed and it reset. No, now if you got killed while you had crime, you were actually respawned into prison, and then you had to work your way out of the prison. You had to find ways to escape, things like that. And that was another gameplay loop. By now, the game has been expanding so much. So you have, for example, if you look at just Star Citizen, you have mining gameplay loops, you have trading gameplay loops where you just have to find the optimal way to trade to earn money. You have combat, of course, which with something like a space sim can be either just ship-to-ship combat, or you have an actual gun in your hands and you're trying to like raid a small little base, things like that. All of these are gameplay loops, and these are, as it says, core to your game. But why should you care? Well, your game, assuming that you're making your own game, will also have these core gameplay loops that you'll probably be able to recognize. In our case, for example, Forge Industry. We're a resource management and automation game, and we actually have multiple loops as well. Of course, we have our basic one where it's crafting things. Crafting things has become a gameplay loop for us, but it goes much further than that, because what else can you do in your game? Well, we have our shipping and like our greater world interaction. That also becomes a gameplay loop. Then you have the researching and upgrading of like your stations or your materials and things like that. That also becomes a loop. Those are all like individual components of your game that when put together makes the whole experience really. So what I urge you to do now is, if you are working on your own game, sit down for a second and see how many core gameplay loops you can come up with. Maybe you have a fantasy RPG where you have, of course, the combat loop, the exploration loop, maybe some puzzles as well. So your puzzles would actually be a loop as well. And generally, the more loops you have, the like bigger your game is and the more replayability your game will have. If you have only one core game loop, well, chances are that a player will get bored of it after just like 1 or 2 hours. But if you have 10 gameplay loops, well, they can keep switching around and they can keep improving. And then you get something like, for example, a RuneScape, where you have all of these different skills. You could almost see every skill. So maybe wood chopping or just going fishing or whatever, or I don't know, basket weaving. I've never played RuneScape. All of those things are individual gameplay loops. Now, the ones in RuneScape, especially old school RuneScape, are very crude, as you just click things usually, but you can expand upon those. And the more gameplay loops you have, as I said, the more gameplay you simply have. Now, don't do like Star Citizen, don't get carried away and decide to create this huge open world game that has like 50 different gameplay loops with potion crafting and with like alchemy and magic and all of those things. You're probably a solo developer or a small team indie developer. Go for anywhere between 3 and 7 core gameplay loops is what I would say, to keep it manageable but also keep your game fun to keep replaying. Now, how do you make a core gameplay loop really? As I said, think about what are the main things you want to be able to do in your game. So maybe you have exploration, you have combat, and you have like crafting or something like that. And those would be your 3 main loops. Well, now what we need to do is we need to add challenges to each loop. So for example, there are multiple ways to craft something in games. Either you have like the very easy option where it's just, oh, I want to make, I don't know, a sword. Well, you just like select it in a drop down menu and you just press, okay, make this now. Taking away all of the parts such as resource gathering or having to know the recipe and things like that. Versus one way to add challenges is in Minecraft, for example, you have to actually draw the pattern of the item you want to create. So maybe for a pickaxe, you would need to put 2 sticks and 3 stone in the correct orientation before you can actually craft it. This is a way to add a bit of challenge to whatever you're doing. With combat, of course, you can greatly expand upon this with how punishing or how hard you want your combat to be. Do you want millimeter precise timings that the player can do and with like fatalities and whatnot? Or is combat more secondary and it's just, you know, you have a basic attack, you have a special attack, and maybe you can dodge as well? Those are things as well that you need to take care of in your gameplay loop. So as I said, you have at most 7 gameplay loops and you ideally have 2 of those that you really flesh out, because those are what makes your game special and unique. And that's usually what you would use in all of your promotional material. Now, of course, you wouldn't just write all of this down. Next up, you would program them. But what's most important once you've had them implemented is make your loops iteratively. What I mean is, don't spend too much time first thinking out, oh, I want to be able to do this, this, and this. No, instead you want to get a minimum viable product of each loop, basically, where you can just play around with it and playtest it. I keep saying this, we made a big mistake at the beginning of our own game development. We did not do enough playtesting. Whatever gameplay loop you have, send it to someone, ask someone for feedback, or even just play it yourself and try different ways to approach the same gameplay loop and take your lessons from there. There's so much you can learn from playing your own game, yet often we're too focused on making the game instead of playing what we're making that we forget what we're doing and don't really know if what we're actually doing is good or is fun. And if a game isn't fun, there's no real point in making it. So in conclusion, gameplay loops are crucial to your game. You can't have a game without them, but often you don't really think about them. Gameplay loops are one of those things that come to us naturally that we don't really think about, oh, I should plan my gameplay loop like that. No, you decide, you're like, oh, I'm gonna implement combat, not I'm gonna implement the combat loop and all of the things. What's important is the loop part means that you can replay your game. That's about everything I had to say about gameplay loops. Probably a bunch of extra things Star Citizen taught me, but this was the core thing that I really wanted to share with you guys. If you're new here, we're a game development studio working on our own game Forge Industry, as well as creating this kind of informational content, or also maybe just some vlogs behind the scenes of when we go to events and things like that. If you're interested in indie development, or maybe you just want to follow along with our own development, be sure to go ahead and leave us a like as well as subscribe down below, as it really helps us out. And in return, you get this cool content 2 times a week. So it's a win-win for both of us, really. That's all I have to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!